Good afternoon, welcome. My guest today is someone who's been in so many different industries. Currently, I'm trying to count them all. You've been in education, you've been in healthcare at one point, you've been in business, and currently the head of neurodivergent charity AP Cymru. It is Sean Allen. Sean, how are you doing today?
Yeah, very well. I should probably slightly nuance that. I'm head of learning and development. Otherwise, Karen at AP Cymru will have my guts for garters. So
It's a very important role at the company, of
yeah,
course.
definitely.
Now, you're a very busy man. You're also working with Penybont FC in the Welsh League. So, I suppose first and foremost, how did you get into working with AP Cymru?
I started volunteering there in 2011. At the time, I was a full-time primary school teacher, and I think I quickly realised within that kind of formal educational setting that sport and PE, as much as I love them, aren't fully inclusive for all children. So I still can't remember, I don't think Karen can either, what the connection was, but someone introduced us. I offered to run some physical literacy sessions over the summer halls for the children that the charity worked with. So those children range from around the age of around 5 to 14, 15. I did the physical literacy sessions for them, stayed in touch, and the relationship just grew from there, really.
So, you'd mentioned physical literacy. We'll get into that because that's something you feel very deeply about.
I do.
But when you were initially in sort of education, because you've been all over the world in your job, did you ever notice any neurodiverse policies in school when you first started off?
Not at the time, no. Neurodivergence as a kind of catch-all term, I would say, I've only really been introduced to in the last 5 years. So it's although it's ultimately always existed within an educational framework in terms of neurodivergent young people, I don't think, you had your ALN, you had your kind of SENCO, but neurodivergence was never really spoken about, even though you could identify and recognise ND children. There was no real kind of formal term, I guess, at that time, but there is now.
And where would you say the whole conversation around it is now compared to where you started out?
Far more positive in terms of recognising differences, not a deficit. I've thought long and hard, because I deliver ND training, when we look at the 7 most prevalent neurodivergent conditions and then how those conditions usually relate in terms of traits and behaviours. Some people get triggered by the word trait. Some people get triggered by the word behaviour. It's very difficult to have a conversation about this type of thing without somebody taking umbrage to something that you say. So we work off intention. If your intention is to learn and to develop, then the person you're with needs to accept and understand that sometimes you might not use the correct terminology. But I've often thought about, would it be more amenable to all neurotypes if, rather than speaking about conditions, we spoke about the challenges? Because we talk as a charity and as an organisation about working with the person and not the condition. And yet we sometimes fall into the trap of talking about the conditions and not the person. So I sometimes think, especially when I'm delivering to young people, should we even introduce terms such as autism, OCD, ADHD, or should we just talk about the challenges that some people in society face?
Well, let's expand upon that, because you still work in a school setting as well down in Monmouth. And what would you say the main challenges that particularly young people are facing, and particularly in sport at the moment, with regards to the ND movement?
I'd say a big thing in education is still awareness. Not so much my school, because I'm there now talking about it, but in my experience, often I'll go into schools and I'll deliver, and when I'm talking to them, a lot of them, neurodivergence is quite a new concept. And to me, it should form the bedrock of any educational training, because statistically 1 in 5 people have got a diagnosis of being neurodivergent, but that's a formal diagnosis, so that's as low as it can be, 1 in 5. As a charity, we work off more 1 in 3. So if you've got 30 children in your class, there's a likelihood that 10 are likely to be neurodivergent. So if you're not aware of the types of challenges that these youngsters face, you're basically saying that a third of my class won't be given everything that they need in that environment to thrive. And it's even more noticeable, I would say, in sport, because as much as I love sport and I love PE, a lot of the conditions that we talk about and the associated challenges are really brought to the fore in that type of competitive environment.
Let's talk about sport then, because it's a really tough, really competitive environment. And some say people with neurodiverse conditions thrives. Others say, you know, it's a bit of a hindrance at times. What side of the fence are you on with regards to that debate?
It's a good question. Can I talk a little bit about physical literacy?
Yeah, of course, absolutely.
So for those of you that don't know what physical literacy is, a kind of working definition, an easy way to understand it is you're giving people, young people in school, the skill, the confidence and the competence to express themselves physically. So someone that's physically literate is more likely to gravitate towards sport because they're going to want to display how literate they are in the physical kind of realm. That is brilliant, and that is fully inclusive because you're taking every child where they are and you're moving them on kind of in safe increments. What it's not doing is putting a ball in the middle of them and saying, right, we're going to have a game. Half of you are going to lose, half of you are going to win. So I've gone off on a little bit of a tangent, but I would say if the schools got to think, I suppose, take it back to basics. What as a school are you trying to achieve? And I would say it's not just about exams. It's about experiences and it's about building positive memories for these kids so that whether it's numeracy, literacy, I wouldn't have done my job if kids leave primary school never wanting to read another book again. So it's like, well, you've got to instill in them a love of reading and a love of learning. And it's the same thing, I think, with physical literacy and sport. They've got to play rugby. They've got to play football because it's part of the curriculum. But if we're doing our job as educators, they should then want to continue playing sport like throughout their adult lives as well. And I think if we better understand the inner workings of all of our brains, particularly obviously young people's, we're more likely to build frameworks that then give them that, whatever the subject is, that love of it, so they can continue it then through their rest of their lives, really.
So imagine now you are, you know, a child in school who's suffering with, I don't know, ADHD or autism, and maybe sport isn't necessarily your preferred area of expertise. As someone who develops those frameworks, how do you go about integrating them into the game in a way that is truly inclusive?
So it's really challenging with a lot of the sports which are still in the curriculum, like things like football, rugby, cricket, these types of sports. There's other sports which it's easier, I would say, to make them more inclusive. But if you think about an autistic young person, often they really struggle in a group dynamic. Like I used an example to a friend earlier, like turn taking. So they'll internalize turn taking and they won't necessarily pick up on the social cues of when it's their turn to speak, when it's their turn to listen. So 1-to-1, they've got that challenge with one other person. Put them in a group of 10 people and all of a sudden they're overwhelmed because there's 10 other people who are also vying for that available time. When do I talk? When do I... This type of thing, right? So if you think about that as a game, well, you could build into the football program constant 1v1s. So they've got ball time, they've got huge amount of ball time because they're either going to be out of possession trying to win it back or in possession with the ball at their feet. Put 3 or 4 other people in that game, they could be overwhelmed. Give them a 1v1 scenario, which essentially all these small-sided games, you're creating 1v1s within that group game anyway. So there are loads of little things you can introduce. Things as it might sound silly, but obviously a neurodivergent brain can often be overwhelmed and they can often take in more information within their environment. So I won't, or as much as possible, I won't have games lessons in noisy, busy environments when, the groundskeeper's cutting the grass next to them because they're trying to focus on, and that could, it could be not just autism, ADHD. They're trying to focus on me, but they're being bombarded with all this other information within the environment. So I'm almost setting them up to fail because then they get told off for not listening. And actually they are trying harder than probably everyone else to listen, but they're just taking in more information within the environment.
So to me, that sounds like it's all about individualized lesson plans, perhaps. But how difficult is it when you are designing a sort of national or central curriculum? Because obviously, with something like neurodiversity, no one's brain works the same.
It depends, I guess, what your criteria is for a curriculum. So is it at the end that, you want every pupil to be a level 5, which in itself, to me, doesn't really mean much.
Just to clarify, a level 5.
So that we're moving away to a certain extent now, but when I first started teaching, all pupils were expected, I think, don't quote me on this, but when they left primary school and went into high school, they'd all be a level 4A, like English or literacy, numeracy, and mathematics. And that there was obviously a criteria for each level. But then you could say about anything. If, use you as an example, Ethan, if you come into year 6 and I'm your classroom teacher and you're working at a 4C because you've had a great year in year 5, and I move you on a little bit and by the end of it you're a 4A, technically brilliant, we've done what we need to do, you're in high school, see you later. There's another child in our class who came in a low 3C, has worked their absolute socks off and has just managed to get a 4C. Like, the school would be looking at that and they'd be saying the 4A pupils obviously achieve more. Well, you're not looking at where they've started from. And we had this conversation, well, it's got nothing to do with ND per se, even though statistically a lot of children in care are neurodivergent, often undiagnosed. We had this conversation last night, me and a close friend. A youngster who's spent their whole life in care hasn't had the kind of, the archetype of mum and dad looking after them. They've been shunted from pillar to post. They're carrying all this trauma with them. In my opinion, that child who leaves sixth form with 3 Cs versus another child who's, and whilst it's not, it's no fault of their own, has gone to private school, has had a private tutor, and has left sixth form with 2 A's and a B. Well, if I'm part of the recruitment team on a university, I'm thinking, bloody hell, a child's been in care all their life, hasn't had the parental support, and has managed to get 3 A levels. These kids should be getting the leg up, and that we should be saying we should be rewarding the potential and this type of thing. So it's the same thing with an ND child. Like, we've worked with youngsters, one of whom kept getting told off for humming in class, and it turns out they were also undiagnosed narcoleptic, and they were humming to try and keep themselves awake because they didn't want the teacher to think they weren't enjoying the lesson. That child was getting into trouble every day for humming. But actually, when you peel back the layers and work with the child and find out why they're humming, it's actually like what a noble thing for a child to be doing because they don't want to upset the teacher.
Yeah.
And that same teacher was telling them off.
It's so challenging, isn't it? Especially when there's a greater awareness of neurodiversity and you get a lot more, undiagnosed people maybe questioning that. Have you noticed that in recent years, perhaps, there's a bit of a difference between how some people who before might not have necessarily had the support are seeking it a bit more?
I definitely think there's less of a stigma attached to identifying as neurodivergent. A neurotypical person sometimes, again, I think can get quite annoyed because within a workplace or within a school environment, they might see a neurodivergent child, say, getting extra support or reasonable adjustments, and then we think, why can't I get that? Our whole kind of shtick as a charity is you can. If you build inclusivity into the design of whatever the environment is or whatever the program is, you're basically giving everybody what they need at that particular time. So, again, use us as an example. I'm neurodivergent, you're neurotypical. We both struggle in a co-working space when we haven't got our own kind of structured environment and this type of thing, right? I need it because the way my brain is wired, if I haven't got that structure and that, what's the right word? That constant, every time I come to the office, I know I won't be able to do my work, right? You actually prefer it. Well, as an organisation, why can't we say, you don't need a diagnosis in order to have your own desk? It's, if you feel like you need your own desk to do your job to the best of your ability, let us know and we'll accommodate that. The neurodivergent person gets it because they need it. The neurotypical person gets it because it's their preferred style of working. So by being fully inclusive and by creating this kind of like inclusive environment, you're not taking away from anyone. You're just offering everybody everything and saying, take from it what you get the greatest benefit from.
It's almost a redistribution of sort of skills, I suppose.
Definitely. And like I said, it's like everything. It's really, really hard because it's also open to abuse, just like everything is open to abuse. Mental health, you could have someone in the room really, really struggling with their mental health who needs support, and you could see someone else who sees a green light and thinks, bloody hell, do you know what, I could get an afternoon off as well. And this, within anything that you create, there will be a small minority who will try and take advantage and gain whatever it is you've created. But I don't think that should be a reason for not offering it to everyone. So for me, again, sport and PE in school, what's the reason behind offering it? Physically active, being healthy, raising your confidence. So just say as a school, we've got rugby in the winter, football, spring, whatever you want to call it, athletics in the summer, right? If there are children within my cohort who I'm looking after who are neurodivergent and can't play rugby because of the sensory overwhelm, they hate rain. I work with a colleague who can't go out in the rain unless she's got an umbrella because of the physical overwhelm. Right? Now, imagine a child saying that to me in school. You just have to get on with it. The sensory overwhelm of, I've got my personal space. I'm now walking onto a dirty, muddy, grassy pitch where someone who I haven't allowed into my personal space comes and smashes me because I'm holding a rugby ball in my hands.
Yeah.
So why would I put that child through that every single week? It's almost cruel.
Yeah.
So build into that, there could be another option for pupils that really struggle in that environment. And you're not saying they have to be in that, you're basically just offering it to them. But again, like I've got a neurodivergent child in my class who is involved in the rugby, never makes a tackle, never catches the ball. So I say to him, right, your job, buddy, I want you to almost just track. So come behind your defensive line. So you're always 10 meters behind and you're just telling people where the danger is. So he does that. He finishes the game and he genuinely, you can just tell by the way he feels like he's taken an active part in the game.
Yeah.
And he hasn't made a tackle and he hasn't caught the ball. But ultimately, why would I make him catch the ball if that means he's going to get hit by another child, which is going to upset him for the rest of the day? And then he can't focus in a numeracy session because he's still thinking about the game session and he's getting told off in numeracy for not listening. So, yeah, you can't take anything in isolation.
It is so tough as well in an environment like sport. We did have a brief chat, and one thing you said that really stood out was sport is not designed for neurodivergent people. It is, in a way, designed for neurotypical people. So do the needs of certain individuals get lost sometimes in that will to win at a competitive level? I
think they do. But you could have this conversation really about sport and competitive sport, couldn't you? About everything. So we've had a child in school recently diagnosed autistic, really struggles in music lessons because of the overwhelm. Mum and dad are really supportive, but several times now the child's got up in the middle of a music lesson, gone to all the musical instruments, started playing them all, banging them all, this type of thing, right? Child gets into trouble because they're doing something they shouldn't be doing within that environment. Mum and dad are saying, well, you should be creating an environment that essentially allows my child to be their authentic self. But again, it's nuanced because if the same child is with their parents and says, I want to walk down the middle of the road, you wouldn't let them. But you could turn that around and say, well, you're not allowing the person to be their authentic. So, like I said, it's so situational. So what I've suggested within school is that child can't just get up and play those instruments when they want, because that's not an acceptable way of behaving within that environment. However, if the child does feel the need to play an instrument, there's a little breakout room and there's a xylophone, there's a glockenspiel, there's a triangle, there's instruments where they can go in a quiet space and play them and then come back into this environment. So often it's just about thinking creatively and thinking how can you still give the child what they need without it negatively impacting everyone else within that environment. So you think about sport and football. Again, I'm neurodivergent. I want to play football. But every time I say I want to play in the school team, I pick the ball up. You can't really play football then because it's a rule within football that you can't pick the ball up. However, I could create a game that wasn't as competitive, which allowed that child to pick up the ball and still to play. So it's such a hard one.
Yeah.
Because, someone in a wheelchair might want to play men's football, but they can't play men's football because they're in a wheelchair and they play on grass. But there's other forms of football which are accessible to someone with that condition or with that challenge. So it's so hard to kind of, but again, it's intention, isn't it? So if your intention, my intention is, because it's almost, I know I've gone off on a bit of a tangent. I struggle sometimes saying this in training because I don't want to lose people, the ND training. It's almost virtually, I think, impossible to create an environment that is 100% inclusive 100% of the time, because you don't know who's going to walk through the door. And what I say is, I play a little bit of golf. Every time I go on to the golf course, I want to play par golf. I want to have 18 pars. I'm never going to get 18 pars, but it doesn't stop me going out every week with the intention of trying. So it's the same thing. I think if as a group, as a society, as a school, as an academic institution, you think, right, our goal is to be as inclusive as possible. We're never probably going to hit that 100%, but it doesn't stop us from trying to get there. So I just think it's that you could apply that to sport, in school, to PE, to any subject. And it is just about having that open mindset.
And do you think, to a degree, it's more about creating, because again, you mentioned authentic self. Do you think it's about giving potential players or, future athletes or what have you, the ability to decide if they want their authentic self to be part of themselves in a sporting context?
Yeah, definitely. And it's funny you've said that, because when I started to deliver the training, this is like 3 years ago, I said one of our goals is to create an environment where everyone could be their authentic self. But I've changed that now so that I'm creating conditions that allow everyone to be their authentic self if they want to, which is, it's a subtle distinction, but it's massive. Because you might still not want to reveal certain aspects of yourself within that environment. And I'm not saying you've got to. So a good example, I guess, would be, think about like how prevalent homophobia is in football. If I was manager of a football club, I'd like to create the environment within that changing room that if I had a gay player could be openly gay. However, if they don't feel comfortable and they don't want, not comfortable, if they don't want to tell the rest of the team they're gay or to be authentically gay in that environment, then they don't have to. But they know that if they can, they're going to be accepted.
There's always that support mechanism in place.
Definitely.
Let's discuss as well this thing called exercise snacking. Tell me more about this, because I was really interested when I read about this.
So, funny enough, I've just bought a book and I'm pretty sure it was in that. I read it, it's called the 1 minute workout, which is a bit of a misnomer, but it's all about, again, exercise snacking. So the way our concentration spans are going as a society anyway, it's worse and worse and worse. So primary school children in the main aren't going through maturation, so they're not developing adolescence and things like, again, you can't have a blanket rule, but it usually comes in high school when puberty starts and things like that. So ultimately, youngsters don't sweat and don't perspire and in the same way as teenagers and adults do. So exercise snacking means if you've got 1 hour within your curriculum every week of PE, 10, 15 minutes is lost both ends getting them changed. So already you're down to 30 minutes. So whether it would be a case of allowing children on those days to wear the school tracksuit or, the school hoodie and tracky bottoms, so they haven't got to change. But rather than having a 1 hour, I think it would be far better to have 4 15-minute bursts, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, when it's physical literacy, functional movements. You're getting children to enjoy being physically active, as opposed to, and because the sport can come later. if you think of it, it's like the Maslow hierarchy of needs, but if you apply that to like a sporting principle or sporting perspective, if you haven't got physical literacy, you're never ever going to realize your physical potential in sport. You have to quantify that, but what I can tell you is if you put this into schools, more kids will want to play sport because they'll want to express themselves physically. And they said, great idea, but as an organization, we're heavily focused on sport. And organised sport and recognised sport. So I was like, okay, no worries. And then about 6 months later, I think it was around £8 million they received from the Welsh government to promote physical literacy in schools. And things like that, again, there's no point being bitter in it, but it's just disappointing that a huge organisation like that had a really passionate, who was talking about physical literacy before they maybe even knew what it was. Yeah, it's just disappointing, But so what I've carried on doing, but at a much, I guess, smaller reach than I wanted to, kind of thing. But it doesn't mean to say, hopefully one day that reach won't grow.
He is hoping. So I suppose to close out on, Sean, where do you see the sort of neurodiverse sport development program being in about 5 to 10 years' time? Do you see it gathering pace, or do you maybe see some difficulties it could run into?
Yeah, I think there'll still continue to be challenges because having an awareness of neurodiversity is completely different to having an awareness and understanding and an acceptance. And I'd say ultimately anything like this, there's a heavy responsibility on people higher up the food chain thinking about how to make traditional sports inclusive. So it might look different to how it currently looks, and it might be about tweaking and modifying, current things. And although, again, you might get pushback straight away from traditionalists, but you were getting that same pushback, I imagine, from traditionalists in cricket, and then all of a sudden 2020 comes along and the 100 comes along. Yeah. Tennis traditionalists, although it's a different sport, paddle is now massive because people recognise that actually there's a more enjoyable way of hitting a ball across a net.
Yeah.
So and obviously whilst that's got nothing to do with ND per se, these traditional sports have been tweaked to make them more accessible for people. So I don't think there's any reason why those sports can't be tweaked to make them more more inclusive as well for all neurotypes.
And final question, I suppose, if there was one thing you had to say to the policymakers and to those who shape how this is implemented, because I know, for example, that the FAW's PAUB vision, that ends this year, so they will shortly be introducing a new one. What would your one main thing to them be?
I can't remember what the Latin is, right? And I don't want to sound cringe, but in English, it's basically like something along the lines of like not for us, without us. So I would just say get as many ND voices as you can into the conversation as possible, because A, you don't know what you don't know. B, you only see the world through your lens. And the huge takeaway since I've been working at AP Cymru, delivering the training in a paid capacity, is I've learned so much, not from talking, but from listening to ND people. So someone that's not dyspraxic, I never thought that a barrier to delivering presentations could be dyspraxia. But a colleague of mine, when she's anxious, her dyspraxia is more pronounced. So she can't plug all the cables into the whiteboard or the laptop, whatever it is, when she goes out and delivers. So there's an invisible barrier there, which I've never, ever even thought of because I'm not dyspraxic. So if you're trying to develop a neurodivergent policy for sport or for Sport Wales, wherever you want to do, get as many people within that structure as you can who are neurodivergent, because they'll have the answers. They will have the answers because they lived their whole lives having to modify and having to tweak what currently exists anyway. So listen to them.
Wise words. Sean Allen, thank you very much for taking part. Can the listeners have some information of where to find your charity, by the way?
Yeah. So geographically, we're based in Taftswell. We work with any families pre, post, or who are along the diagnostic pathway. So you don't need, you don't need to have a formal diagnosis to access all our services. It's an amazing charity full of amazing people. Karen, the chief exec, she's a one-off. You've got to meet her because she's just the most wonderful person. Our website is apcymru.org.uk. I'm sure we're on Insta, AP Cymru. But yeah, I mean, obviously you've got my contact details as well. So if anyone seeing this wanted to reach out to you and you could put them in touch with me, that's absolutely fine, Ethan, as well.
I'm always available. Thank you very much, guys. Thank you.